The last session for today is with Phil Regnauld from DNS-OARC and also Raffaele Sommese from University of Twente. And it's intro to best practices and a panel discussion.
So we're going to try something a little bit different for this OARC. We did have panel discussions in Prague for those of you who were here, and they were a raving success, we thought. And we thought we'd continue the trend and talk a little bit about BCPs and operations at DNS-OARC. So very quickly to introduce this, as you can see, we got some panelists who are coming up the stairs, so I'll try and keep this brief. The idea is that we have this O in OARC, and it means operations. And it does mean that there's a fair amount of operational content at OARC. A lot of it has to do with measurement on operational aspects and discussions on interoperability. But there's also one aspect that I don't think has been neglected, but we need to bring a little bit back to the center, which is how do we help the operators of the DNS to best deploy, operate, and run their DNS. So the idea here is, this thing's working, yeah. Who's coming to OARC? Well, we've got software developers and vendors, we've got our researchers, we've got our operators, and what do we talk about? We mostly have some presentations about the DNS, and nothing but the DNS. So what about BCPs? What about best common practices? Because some of those talks have conclusions with them. They have some definite directions they're pointing to on the way that the DNS should be running. Things work. We end up deciding on flag days. So everything that's being talked about at OARC has an impact. Now, one thing we don't talk about is best practices. And the first thing, of course, is what's a BCP? Do we even agree about that? And one of the things that we were discussing as we were about, to bring together this panel is that could we get people on stage to talk about what they think is a best common practice versus a recommendation or, a hard standard limit. And so it is, as I think we can all agree, it's a set of guidelines and operational considerations that the majority of people in the community think are beneficial to running your DNS infrastructure. And where do these things come from? So some of them are guided by operational experience. I do it this way because it works for me, because it minimizes my downtime and so, or could be an architectural consideration. And some of them may become configuration defaults over time into the software. Some of them might influence some policymakers into deciding this is the way that DNS should be running. Discussions of encryptions aside, it could be things such as whether or not to observe certain packet sizes and so on. Some of the guidelines will be directly coming from the policy world. NIS2, I guess, is kind of front and center here. There's a CRA, and of course, there's this new Cyber Executive Order 14144. We'll see how long that sticks, but for now it's there. And this does talk about improving cyber resiliency. And finally, there are other areas of operational best practice that have an impact on the DNS by nature of network connectivity and network best practices like manners. Anyway, there are already best practice initiatives out there that exist. There's manners, which I just mentioned for the routing part. In the DNS world, we have something of a bit of an ambiguous, I would say, so disclosure. I have been involved with kindness. There is the kindness initiative, which initiated by ICANN to collect best practices around the DNS and put them forward for the community to consider. And there's also RIPE's recent resolver recommendation. So we do have those. So the idea here is when we have this panel discussion is not so much to discuss what new BCPs we could come up with. It's more what's a BCP and what should OARC be doing about it. So who decides what's a BCP? The community. And who is the DNS community if not the people in this room? And remote, of course. So what could OARC do? So we think, at least, and when I say we, I think it's both a staff discussion, I think it's a community opinion that OARC's the right place to have these discussions. The question is, we have these chats on Mattermost, the operations mailing list, and we have the OARC meetings. And wouldn't it be great to actually go one step further and actually evaluate some of those best practices out there and identify maybe some of the ones that are not being considered enough or are not even being implemented, and say, can we do anything to improve availability and reliability of the DNS by using the OARC forum to, of course, test these ideas, to try and draw the line between what is a BCP and a recommended practice, and of course, define a scope. How far do we go? Is system hardening part of it? What about zone content? So once we're done with this, we'll see if there's outcomes to be pursued in terms of, do we really have buy-in from the OARC community, the DNS community, that it'd be worth spending time on this? Should we be doing this for the sake of the community? It also means giving OARC more of a voice and a little bit more of a position taking, which historically OARC hasn't really done on all things operational, all things, on deploying the DNS. And defining the scope, whether we're going to stick to just the DNS, the protocol, or are we going to go a little bit further than that on what are the systems that impinge on your DNS working well or not. And of course, try and consider existing initiatives. So have a role to review, validate, categorize, prioritize BCPs, and then in the end, what is the mission of OARC? It's to improve the robustness, resilience, and the stability of the DNS. So this kind of dovetails nicely, and this is what we're looking for. So who's we? Well, that's a good question. It's anybody who's on the on the Mattermost server, anybody who's a member at OARC, anybody coming to these workshops, and we'll try and see if there's interest to pursue this. And of course, Raffaele is also going to come with his researcher hat on and explain what he thinks would be useful in terms of measurability. Do we have any BCPs we can deploy that are actually measurable, and how would we do so? Because that is also an interesting topic for future OARCs. That's it. I don't think I want to say anything more. It's enough to introduce the whole concept. So we have 9 wonderful panelists who volunteered to step up here today with different hats on. So I don't think I can do anything better than ask them to introduce themselves and what role they come to this panel with, what hat they're wearing as they're sitting on the stage here. So we'll start with you, Nikolai.
Yeah. Does it work? Yeah, okay. So Nikolai Lehmann, I'm from Deutsche Telekom. I'm mainly doing architecture and strategic work, and in that context, I'm also trying basically to align all the DNS activities, not only in Germany, but in the different countries, which also includes a mid to long-term strategy for new features and also for features we are going to implement in all the NatCos.
I'm John Todd. I'm the general manager of Quad9. We're a global recursive resolver.
Stefan Ubbink, SRDN, the .nl registry, and I work mainly for signing and providing .nl to the world.
Thanks. I'm Suzanne Wolf, and I've actually worn a lot of hats in the DNS industry, like since before it was really an industry. Phil was making fun of me for my longevity earlier today. Stop that. I've been a DNS engineer for a hosting company. I've been a root server operator, software engineering manager for an implementer, co-chair of the DNS-OP working group in the IETF, and currently I work for a TLD operator, Public Interest Registry. You've heard of us as .org. And like a lot of TLD operators, we don't run our own infrastructure, but we are in the DNS business, and it's really important to us to understand and be able to control how we interact with all the other pieces of the DNS ecosystem. So something like a broad BCP effort is of great interest to us.
Eddie Winstead, ISC. In my role at ISC, I do a lot of consulting, so I would say best practices are at best a mild suggestion, it seems. So I see a lot of crazy stuff, as you might imagine. So yeah, I'm interested to hear what everyone has to say about what we should do.
Hi, this is Puneet Sood from Google. I have been the tech lead for Google Public DNS for about 7 years. Baby stuff compared to Suzanne, so that's my primary interaction with DNS. And given the scale we operate at, we are really interested in making sure things work smoothly without requiring a lot of manual effort, basically visibility, monitorability, those kind of things. Thank you.
Ralph Weber, Akamai. Akamai does all things DNS. We sell software, authoritative recursive, we run it. We also use it for our CDN, so DNS is very much front and center to us, and of course we want to have a good operation on it.
Steve DeYoung, Ultra DNS. Ultra DNS is a managed DNS provider for both primary and secondary DNS services. We serve the DNS for a lot of large enterprises, small enterprises. We serve a secondary DNS for several TLDs and registries, as well as running an open resolver.
Hey, this is Tejas. I'm from Microsoft. I am the engineering lead for authoritative DNS for Azure DNS, which supports third-party customers and most of Microsoft services. It's actually my first time at OARC, so excited to be here and on this panel especially. Thanks.
All right. Okay, well, thank you everybody for introducing yourselves. And needless to say, I don't think we're going to ask everybody to answer every question. The idea of this format is we got a few guiding questions initially to talk about and maybe get the discussion kick-started. And for the next 20 minutes or so, and following that, we will try and turn this over to the microphone. So those of you who are following remotely or even in the room, you want to ask questions on the channel, things to ask about this panel or about this initiative, you're welcome to do so, and we'll take them in the last 10, 15 minutes. I mean, we're between you and the social tonight, so don't want to push this too much. But the first question we want to ask is, what would be, in terms of scope, what's the definition of a best practice? What if we ask, and I think here in this case, of course, it's going to be a different answer depending on which hat the panelists have on, but I'd like to ask, and this is probably a question that we can ask every one of you, what is your definition of a best practice? I think we can start at one end. Yeah, that.
So, okay, for me, so I would define it like a set of questions we have to answer when we look into a DNS deployment, for instance. So it's not so much a detailed guideline for every single feature we have to implement, because we deploying DNS in different areas of the network. We are offering it to our customers as a kind of public DNS. We have a bunch of internal deployments and so on. And I think what you define in that context, best current practice will be different. And we are handling it also in that way. So it's more like you can see it as like a guideline for things you have to watch out and where you have to decide what you want to do. For instance, Anycast, or you assign a bunch of different addresses to an end system.
I'll give that a shot. So best practices, I guess, from our perspective or my perspective, is that there are things that you can do optionally that affect the way that your service works, both internally and externally visibly. So there are things that don't rely on the RFCs, like they're not musts, they're shoulds, or you may. And so which of those practices do you take that makes you the best citizen with your peers in the DNS community or with other parts of the stack, not necessarily DNS, where it's your option to take a particular path. So how does that serve you best? How does it serve your users best? How does it serve the community best? Sort of not necessarily in that order, but they're optional things that are behavioral rather than mandatory for operation of the core service.
From my point of view, as the registry, I would say it would help us to see what is best for our resilience and our availability. So anything that helps us, guide us to that point will help us. So best practice, which is helpful for us as an authoritative name server, might not be helpful for reservers. So it must not be one document that mandates everything for everyone, but geared to the usefulness of the application of the DNS.
For us, I think of best practice as sort of a common and shared understanding of how we should interact, how our services should interact, largely as a contractual tool. We operate under, because we're a GTLD, we operate under two contracts. One for our technical services with our registry service provider, they're terrific. But also we have a contract with ICANN for operating our TLDs. And one of the things that we need, it's important to have a common basis across the broader community. ICANN, operators of other TLDs, operators of related services, for discussing and agreeing what DNS behavior can be relied upon from us and towards us. and it's basically having a body of that shared understanding. We're both a supplier and a customer of DNS services. Having that list, it's a way to use everybody else's work and our own experience to work towards the best possible DNS, preferably at the lowest common cost of strife and misunderstanding. And before I go any further, I should probably disclaim I'm not speaking for my employer today, and my boss is out there somewhere, so he'll tell me if I get out of line.
So I guess operationally for me, best practice is how do I provide or how do I assist someone in providing DNS services for their customers in the best way. And then the other piece of that is how do I provide DNS services without impacting others that are providing DNS services in a negative way. Go back to just the previous talk from Shane, like there are lots of things that folks do that negatively impact others providing services. And then I guess part of what a best practice effort is to me is like we all in this room have a lot of experience with providing these services and have learned a lot of things from our mistakes, and how do we communicate that on to folks that are maybe just starting out, or there's another piece of this for me that's like organizations have like financial constraints, so a lot of times they don't have enough staffing or resources to even approach the topic of how do they educate themselves on DNS. So to me, that's part of what best practice efforts are, is getting that data out there and easily findable.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 points here in terms of the best practices. One is, what is a best practice? In my opinion, it's a combination of a consensus of the community which is running the protocol, who define the protocol, who run the protocol, and that experience has shown that that's a very good idea. Bad things will likely happen if you don't follow that recommendation. I think that's in my mind, the test. That's where I think some of the newer ideas, while they look good to the experts, we don't yet have experience. So it's a combination of those two things. And looking at it purely from a resolver perspective, which sits between authoritatives and the clients, I would say from an operational perspective, best practices are those which allow us to deliver DNS data smoothly, reliably, with minimal overhead from the source to the client. If the whole system doesn't work, it doesn't matter whose fault it is. So we have to have ways which work end-to-end, or at least enable that.
Yeah, I think I want to even take a step back further on what Punita said. I think a best practice is an operational guideline that has been proven by operational reality to be advantages for a certain set of features or functions in the DNS. And I think when we do these stuff, we need to really, with all these things that we decide, have that kind of lackmus test. Has it proven in reality, rather than in the lab or in somewhere in some RFCs, to really be an advantage for the community or for the operation of the DNS?
The best practices that we typically recommend to our customers is availability, is resilience and reachability. And so whether that's name server diversity or AS diversity or anything else, getting that level of availability so that your domain doesn't become unavailable in weird and interesting situations, as we've talked about here today. But that is for those people who are domain owners. They're configuring DNS. They don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the protocol or the RFCs. They have a task, they have tickets that they need to fulfill, and they just need to get the names in there. So being able to have a DNS ecosystem as a domain owner that I can know with some confidence is available and resilient and is not going to take my domain off the internet is the best practice for our customers.
Yeah, a lot of great answers here. But overall, I think as an authoritative provider, a lot of questions we get from customers are like, how do you ensure that my zone that I've hosted here is resilient? So while we may promise some of our resiliency guarantees, at overall DNS level, a lot of customers are curious about how do I make it more resilient? So do I need to host on multiple providers, or what guarantees are you giving me to become resilient and stuff like that? So it's educating customers around that, like publishing more of that information. A lot of our focus is on that resiliency and the best practices around that.
All right. Well, thank you for your take on this. We got some very different answers, but I don't know if I'd be jumping the gun if I were saying that it seems to me that our work would be easier if we did have a set of best current practices that we could point to some extent, or customers or operators. Yeah, or, I'm not concluding beforehand that we need to do this, but if I ask the panel, and I don't know anybody who wants to take that question, do you wish you had a particular place you could point people to and say, hey, you should be really looking at these things when you're deploying your own DNS?
Yeah, so for me it would be definitely helpful because, as mentioned earlier, we're doing checks with best current practice. And the first time we did it was about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And that involved a lot of using Google and checking RFCs. So there was not a single place with, let's say, one document and a guideline and a BCP and something like that. We had to check a bunch of different documents, and would be, I think, or it's going to be very helpful if you have at least a single source of not the documents, but let's say pointers to documents and maybe some kind of meta BCP, which includes the most important topics.
I mean, these best practices, at the end of the day, can be something that you learned over the course of the years with the operational experience, and you as large operators, I mean, can really help like small operators in doing their job better. I think, for example, what happened with the Sierra Leone top-level domain with any record that was leveraged for performing a large DDoS attacks in the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think you're actually hitting on an important point that I'm to answer your question, I'm very interested in one place where we can go to look at best common practices, again, to refer to others and simply say, hey, go look here to see what you should be doing. There's a concern about operational best practices, which are very technical in nature, and we can say, like, this is what you probably should be doing to give better performance or resiliency or reliability. But then there's actually a fairly large set of softer issues that I think we need to talk about as a community that are best common practices, because we have this, the tragedy of the commons here, right? There are things that people can do that they don't even know that they're doing, like the serving any, right? That people don't know they shouldn't be doing, but they hurt others in the community. And we need to be able to say, all right, this is best common practice. This is why I don't want you to do this. We sometimes have to discuss with authoritative operators, like, you're doing something wrong. And this is why it's wrong, and this is why we see that there's negative results of it. And they're like, well, there's really no RFC on this. I'm just going to ignore you because there's no documentation that says anywhere that this is a bad thing. And we really need to have, as a community, some place where we can start to all collect that wisdom into one single place, or collect the documents that have been generated by other groups and put one single place together so we can point out this, to keep the commons a good place to be. At least I'm speaking as a recursive operator, we see this frequently. I'm sure authoritatives and other people see the same issue.
We say similar things, as in we delegate of everything, of course, but we sometimes see things that domains under .nl do, and we want to say that to them, you're not doing quite well from our point of view, please do it better, but it would be useful to see, look here, you can look here and see what's better and why it is better. So that's my point of view.
Yeah, I think having something to point to has a bunch of uses. One of them being that, I can put on my standards development hat for a moment, and there's a lot of RFCs, and it's really hard to tell which ones apply to you in your particular environment and use case. So just having some guidance on that, I think, would be helpful to a lot of people. The other thing is that having a shared repository or a shared place to have these conversations, transparency is a really good thing, and it's hard to get, certainly with regards to, a lot of the technical materials are not terribly accessible or apply only to specific cases or implementations. And it would be beneficial for people to be able to say, oh, I understand, even though I can't tell from what, from the packet dumps what's going on. It's documented, oh, this operator says that they comply with this specification, this BCP. That helps me a lot as far as knowing what to expect from them and how to work with them. And it's all about interoperability.
Yeah, so as a person that spends a lot of time searching for data about what should be done in certain circumstances, I like the idea of having a central location, or at least a known location to start. I think that would be extremely helpful for me and for others.
I think a short yes.
I'm going to elaborate on the yes a bit. So I think DNS is very simple when you first look at it, and awfully complex when you actually work with it. I mean, I've been doing it for 36 years, and I still don't know where all the bodies are buried. So I think what we need to do when we do this, and I think it is a big yes, is we'll have to make sure that not only for the certain functions of the DNS systems we have to do entry points, we also have to probably present it for different levels of kind of variability. Because if I'm telling someone that just started looking at the stuff on empty non-terminals, they're going to call me crazy. So we'll have to make sure that whatever we do, and I'm fully for doing it, we have to make it also consumable by the person that's reading it. So.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that, because there's the aspect of being a DNS operator. So if my authoritative name server is doing something incorrect, or having a reference point to be able to, for John to call me and say, you're broken. On the other hand, there's also our customers who, by and large, don't know anything about how DNS works, and pointing them at a bike shed full of DNS RFCs is not helpful. They're not going to do that. So being able to give those educational tips and tricks and best practices in one common location that is agreed upon by the broader community, that's sort of above the RFCs or a distillation of the information in the RFCs, is super helpful.
Yeah. I think definitely wholeheartedly support all the ideas here, especially the previous point where these may be treated as sort of like not much to do in RFCs and things like that. If they were segregated and said like these were actually best practices and potentially not a must, but these should probably be followed if you want a resilient DNS end-to-end, helps a lot. And then if LLMs can do a good job actually getting this information right, will be good.
I want to pick on something that Stefan said about STLD. We look to the domain names that we host, and we look, for example, on how they behave on certain characteristics. There are some TLD, especially in Europe, that runs incentive program, for example, for deploying DNSSEC. There are incentive program for deploying security characteristics in the domain name ecosystem. So there is an economic incentive if you enable certain feature. Maybe we should not get to the point where you force people to do something, but there may be incentive to adopt certain kind of best practice for the good of the internet. And now I'm saying DNSSEC here. I'm just saying general best practices.
General things to improve could be incentivized by registries if they want to improve their zone. And we have quite successfully done that with DNSSEC, but also still doing that with other incentives for example, Dane. And I know that Switch for .ch is doing something similar, and there are probably others as well, but I'm not aware of those. So anyone else think that incentives will be a good idea? Maybe Puneet?
So we recommend to our customers frequently, sign your zones, right? Sign your zones. And it's a common practice. There's a very significant educational part to that. What is DNSSEC? Why do I care? What's the value to me? Why would I bother? There is also the administrative bits that prove to be a barrier to entry. I have to go back to my registrar, who then needs to speak on my behalf. And as the registrant or as a DNS provider, I can't do various things directly with the registry that I'm working with. I have to go through some third party. So that introduces a whole different set of reluctance in terms of best practices on behalf of the domain owners. But on the other hand, why would I sign? Educating people, educating domain owners. Why is DNSSEC important? It's been around forever. It's always been sort of this big scary thing with keys and rotations and everything else, but I don't see any value to it. And so there's this education bit that needs to go along with that.
Are you suggesting DNSSEC is a best practice?
Yes, actually, absolutely.
Everybody's still awake.
So I'd actually like to take that a little further. You've described incentives as being a best common practice. I think that's actually an interesting idea. We actually have to, and I'm so much in favor of this idea because we actually have to avoid the opposite, and that is that regulatory pressure is on all technology industry is going to be increasing over time. And so without the visibility of there being some best common practices, at least starting as an industry, without that happening, we invite regulatory oversight in ways that are probably negative. So having the ability to show regulators that we are doing something, that there is a common understanding across the industry and across national borders, I think is very important. So I'm very much in favor of it because I'm not interested in inviting the regulatory vampire into the house.
I just want to make a comment on that because it's really interesting. There's been a development in the last few years, which is that historically, if we look at GDPR and the whole who is debacle, it used to be considered that regulators would only step in when privacy and security were at stake. But the fact is NIS2 is showing in CRA that operational stability for critical operations is now front and center. So we were kind of shielded as operators, but the grumbling that's been happening in the TLD operator forums and center and other venues about the new requirements auditing your software chain and all these things just goes to show we need to have something there. We can't have a vacuum. Now, there was a comment, I was trying to follow the chat on the workshops channel. One thing that was interesting, somebody was saying, yeah, I mean, those things best practices also do evolve over time and they become stale. See what I did there? And obviously that's why they're called best current practices. So it's not because I want to address that specifically, but I think the idea is that if we start pointing to these best practices, they have to be updated over time. And when they're not relevant anymore, we're going to have to update and say this is not relevant anymore. This is not the way we do things that way. Some BCPs that used to be taken for granted are maybe, not the best way of doing it, and different operators will have different requirements. So I think, those are a couple of things worth keeping in mind, especially the regulatory aspect. And of course, it means having a forum like OARC, having maybe a bigger voice than it used to have in those things through the community about pointing to this is what you should be doing to stop getting owned.
Just one more comment. I think it's extremely important that the list is being updated regularly. Just an example, half an hour ago, is a presentation about the stale DNS. Honestly, we had to check whether we have enabled the feature or not, and the answer is yes, seems to be enabled in our platform. But the question is it something which is on the list for a best practice, or is it a candidate, or is it something you have to decide on your own?
I just wanted to quickly respond to what John Todd was talking about being proactive ahead of regulations. In my opinion, and that's just my opinion, I'm not a lawyer, I think that may be too optimistic given the current state of both the world as well as technology is now a fundamental part of most people's lives. So just like anything else, banks and everything, we are a regulated industry. So I think that we have to treat with, we'll probably get some benefit from doing it ourselves, but I think the regulators are going to do regulating.
I agree with that, but if you don't have any action or there's no organization for the regulators to approach, then it's going to be a distributed, probably a worse situation. So at least like having a kernel of some best common practices or a kernel of an industry organization is better than not having it, I think is my summary. So you can't, regulators are going to regulate, right? That's what they do. And it's going to be different country by country. But having no response or having no basis, I think is a worse condition.
Yeah, just to add, and they read RFCs. So we had talks with regulators between us and a regulator, and they were referring to RFCs and specifically asking whether we have implemented or enabled a certain feature or not. So they will come, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, we have about 1 second left 10 minutes left on the talk, but we have about 1 second left for the last 10 minutes. And I'm thinking, unless there's something else from the panel that we haven't considered right now, this is just an introductory discussion about this whole thing. I do believe that we're all on the same page that we'd like to improve the stability and the security of the DNS and make it more robust. The question of scope comes up sometimes. OARC 43, there was a great talk about the impact of zone content on operations with regards to CNAME chains or resolver iterations or SALT and NSEC3 and all that. So I think there's also that discussion can be had maybe somewhere else, but I think we can all agree that there is a need for this. I mean, maybe I'm putting things too quickly ahead, but I mean, I think there's some value in that. And I'd like to hear what the community has to say, and at least the people in this room, and if there's some comments remotely, any additions, objections, or,
Hi, Lars Lehmann from NetNode here. You forgot to put someone on the panel who's actually negative to this. So I'll have to do it from the trenches.
Where were you?
I've been operating DNS servers for more than 30 years, and I've seen more errors than many people. I've also been taking part in efforts to try to generate best current practice documents for more than 30 years. And at least Shane here will be not surprised to hear me say that. I am actually rather negative to best common practices when you have such a flexible protocol because it constitutes a single point of failure. If you get all people to do things in the same way, that process is a single point of failure, and someone will attack that. That's like a vulnerability. So I'm much in favor of discussing the problems. And this is a very good venue for that. I'm much in favor of looking at problems that arise from bad practices and to document ways to do it. But what I would like to see is documenting this is a way to do it, it has this consequence, or this is a bad way of doing it, it has this consequence. And I would not like to see a framed table of you must do this, 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 and this, because that's not the way to do. Also, I would urge you, the community, to not look for problems to comment on. There are enough problems that will jump onto you. You don't have to go and vacuum clean the entire system for more problems to look at. We have limited times, all of us. And also, I've heard a lot of talk to say, oh, it would be easy if. Good isn't always easy. Good is sometimes complicated. And to have this just table of do this and that is not necessarily good. It's easy, but it's not necessarily good. And there must be a room for flexibility. We can use this protocol in so many ways. That there must be room for variety. The root name servers operate by diversity is good, and that goes for the entire system in my mind. Also, I've heard complaints about, if you do this in the authoritative server, the recursive servers will, fail. That's partly on the recursive servers. You have to be liberal in what you send and conservative in what you expect, or the other way around. It goes to both sides. I'm not going to put all the blame on the authoritative servers. And of course, regulation is not something that I support a lot. We will be, under regulation, all of us. But please help me and talk to the regulators so they regulate things in the right way. Specified, detailed regulation is not good because things change over time, and that specified regulation will also be a single point of failure in the big thing. Now I'll shut up. Thank you.
Can I, just to go back to where you started, what I'm almost hearing is good common practice and best being the enemy of the good. Where, as you say, about flexibility and so on, and what I'm almost hearing is sort of there's a curation function that's needed, but it can't be rigid. It can't be too tied to expectations and assumptions. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you saying that. The other thing, of course, that we want to stay away from is the whole XKCD problem of, gee, look, there's 12 standards. What are we going to do about that? We're going to have an Uber standard, and now we have 13. And there is something like that as far as things like BCP repositories. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate what you're saying.
I want to comment on that, as in a BCP will not, as for me, will not say you must do this, but you have different options to achieve this. So it doesn't mandate you have to do this exactly, but you have to choose which knobs you want to turn to get the result you need. And not, you have to do this, because then everyone will do this, and then, like you said, they can break it because they know exactly what everyone is doing. Thank you for your comments.
So one thing, I don't think you are actually in disagreement with the people on the panel here. So, because one of the things that I said is there's different functions in the DNS, and there are different practices for different functions. And also, I've talked about, well, it has to be proven in operations, so it has to be something that we recommend should have been kind of proven in operations. And I think you brought a good point up that we should not only do the best current practices, we also should document the worst common practices so people can avoid them.
But I mean, even when I talk to customers, my customers today, so many of them are still using an O'Reilly book that hasn't been updated in several years as their rule of thumb for best practices. It's just not, education is more important, I think, than some rule book of best practices to follow.
Paul Ebersman, Layer 9. One of the things I think we might want to consider, this speaks to some degree of the, if we don't somewhat recommend and regulate ourselves, someone else less informed will regulate us. ISO 9000 and ISO 27000, I have no love of ISO itself, but the function that they had was they were flexible frameworks for how to sort of chew things apart across a very wide variety of different problem sets and companies. And there's an awful lot of industries that wound up being able to say, we are ISO 9000 or 27000 compliant, so we don't need legal regulations. So I think if we start coming up with sort of some, let's call them frameworks of procedures and how to sort of assess what you are doing, to be able to say this is good or bad, and have some references of what they can use as quantitative measures for doing that, we may be able to come up with something that's relatively flexible but gives us that cover.
Relaying for Benno Overender. He says, what makes a BCP widely accepted as a BCP? What is the process? Who manages the process? How or why should OARC play a role for the industry?
I would like to ask Benno to join the work we want to do and give answers to those questions.
Yeah, who else?
So I think for Benno, I think it sounds like he's recognizing the need, but maybe not necessarily the forum.
Meetings. So Warren Kamari, Google. So kind of possibly riffing on what Benno said, and I'm really sad that, I'm here and he's far away because I expect I'm going to get beaten. There have been a number of times where people have tried to do BCP type things. There was the BCOP set of documents, which was in RIPE and NANOG and stuff, and there was some vague discussion and then it kind of died out. There's been the other stuff like kindness, which was in theory generated by the community, and in no way the regulator said, these are voluntary. It would be shame if they didn't become voluntary. But I think there is a bunch of stuff that would be useful for us to do. Right? I think we all agree that it is a best practice to have more than one name server, except when it's not. It's always a good idea to do both TCP and UDP, except when it's not. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we could write down on sort of not necessarily best current practice, but general expectations on how to do things in a non-dumb way. Getting back to I'm probably going to get rocks for this, there is already a group which understands how to publish documents. They also understand this thing called BCPs. Ideally, it seems like this is the sort of thing that IETF and DNS-OP could publish. I agree at the moment, that's not a winning strategy, but it feels like it would be useful if we tried to make it be useful again for that sort of thing. Like, there are a number of BCP documents from other groups and early IETF DNS-OP BCPs, which are actually relatively well-reasoned, thought out, went through the process relatively quickly, and everybody kind of agreed these seem like lowest common denominators. It might be worth us trying to revitalize that and actually make DNS or IETF BCPs be useful again. I don't know how we make it go fast and not turn into, I don't like the color of this particular bike share that you proposed, but it would be useful.
How many RFCs are there that cover what DNS actually does?
Depends how you count. There are many, 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 but that's the problem. There's a whole bunch of them, and they say, you could do this, or you could do that. Having these are the ones that we think are probably what you should do if you're an operator would be really useful. Not the 4,000 random ones, but the 27, these are probably how you should deploy a name server.
So one of the things that always comes up in IETF kind of discussions is we need to get more operator involvement.
Yep.
So I see operators here.
They're welcome here.
So I think the IETF also from the how it is published, I mean, it's a very stringent format how RFCs are published, how they are laid out. I think we want to have something more digestible, and that's where an organization like OARC comes in that can do that without these kind of rigid processes that the IETF has.
Yes.
And not having problem kind of pointing to an RFC that is a BCP if DNS Hub would produce something like that. But I don't think we should kind of preclude our work to have the IETF publish a document. We can do useful stuff and a central location for useful stuff without the IETF.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I mean, yes, it's annoying dealing with the RFC, with the IETF format and XML, and now it's Markdown, which is slightly less awful. However, there's been a number of times when people have tried to write a document series on how to do stuff, and they almost always seem to fail, right? It's not just BCOPs or, there's been network engineers have tried to do it for a long time. Having the IETF structure is annoying, but it's also useful because it's well understood. There is something like an editor who will go through and clean it up. The BCOPs one was people emailing around, as far as I remember, a bunch of Word documents, and people got annoyed with that, and then some of them turned into Git pulls, and then people got annoyed with that. And then because there wasn't the structure, it kind of died. If you want to do this in OARC and make it successful, I think you need somebody who actually knows how to do a document series, a real editor. You need a lot of process and stuff, and it would be great if we can do it, but I'm going to run away now.
We're going over time here. We're going to take last two questions. I just want to address a couple of comments from Warren. One of them is, of course, what you just said about except when it's not. That's the whole idea of saying there's consequences to doing these things. So I think that's easily handled. The other part about IETF versus not IETF, the whole goal of this was not to advocate that OARC start being an editor and write new BCPs. It was more point to what's out there already and encourage the groups that are good at doing this and formalizing some of these things. So OARC is light touch. It's also an organization with very little resources, and we want to remain, I would say, as much as we can, neutral in this respect. But it'd be great to be able to point to the stuff that's out there and point out the gaps in what we have and say we're missing some recommendations there, whether you want to follow them or not, whether they're good or not. that's another discussion. So, yeah, I don't know.
Scott Selzer, speaking personally. Theoretically like the idea of a BCP, but when I start to think about it, my first thought is there's a lot of things that two big groups, people run resolvers, people run authoritative, obviously different. And then beyond that, when I saw the regulatory references, not only does everyone in the room maybe not run resolvers or maybe not run authoritative servers, we're not all in the same regulatory environment. So I don't know how it's practical to have a single document to cover all of that. Otherwise, I think the previous speaker's two things he mentioned might be the only two things I can get everyone to agree on, that we should definitely run more than one server, and that's a good thing. But other than that, I don't know that it's practical for a single monolithic document to cover everyone. Is it multiple BCPs that we should be talking about doing? And I'm sure we could debate that for a couple of years, what they should be.
I think
that was not the question.
Sorry, just to jump in quickly. I think just to clarify how to think about what's being discussed here is, it's not a single document. Think of it more as a DNS wiki with slightly more weight than Wikipedia, in the sense that it's living, people are contributing, and are referring to other authoritative sources of information.
So we're talking about an OARC knowledge base, not a DNS BCP document then?
Correct.
So we are not the DNS police.
No. A list of pointers,
Not
if
yet.
you will. Yeah. Ray?
Yeah. Hi, Ray Bellis, ISC, and mostly. I think it's important that we're not trying to be too prescriptive. We had some talk about that before, with due reference to Phil, who obviously was instrumental in kindness. I think that very much was too prescriptive. Yeah, I'm not going to sign up to an initiative that says I must run diverse OSs and authoritative platforms to run my domain name. It's not going to happen. I think also, this is now more of my OARC board hat on rather than the IC one, I think we should run screaming from any suggestion that should be a tick box ISO 20K or ISO 27K type accreditation scheme, where you can tick a box that says, yeah, we're doing this. That absolutely falls into the prescriptive side of things. And I absolutely agree what we should be looking for is a living knowledge base of good ideas in the DNS and a list of what are generally considered to be bad ideas in the DNS, and not something that absolutely says you must do this. Just shouldn't go there.
I think that's all the time we got, because we've gone 8 minutes over time. It's not a huge amount, but it's the last session of the day. It's clear that we have everybody's got an opinion about this. If I were to wrap this up, I don't think I'd be wrong in saying it'd be a good idea to have a knowledge base or a wiki or something, or at least a catalog of what's out there in terms of what's not a terribly bad idea. Like, if you're going to have two name servers, don't put them on the same subnet as aliases on the same machine. That might be very obvious for some. But hey, you passed the zone test delegation, right? And there's other things that's more ambiguous, and we certainly don't want to be too prescriptive. The idea is to help people run a better infrastructure and to be less vulnerable. There's many aspects to that. It's going to be completely different from recursors and operators and authoritative, but we can continue this discussion online. We can certainly do that on the Mattermost channel or on a mailing list. We're thinking maybe we could create a Mattermost channel and people could chime in there and see what comes out of it. Maybe it dies in a week, maybe some work comes out of it. It really depends how much effort we want to put into it. But OARC, as the staff hat on, if something comes out of this, we'd be happy to provide some editorial function and provide some space for it. And I think it'd make OARC also more interesting for operators to come to the conferences, to the workshops, and come and talk about their operational experience, because I think that some of the most interesting talks we've had are operational problems, not only the measurements, but also just generally, a day in the life of the operator. Anyway, thanks for coming today and talking about your experience. Thanks for everyone for this first day at OARC. Did you have some closing comments?
Yeah. So thank you very much. I am supposed to have some closing comments.